Okay, so thank you, Anna, for the opportunity, and Chechi. It's always been a privilege that I don't ensure that I don't take this stage for granted. I do my due diligence, and thank you to Surya and kids for helping me to prepare and support even at odd hours. And then the credit goes to the rest of who's listed here. Ed Jarrett, a contributing writer at crosswork.com. Article by Jan Bloom on the desiringgod.org. It's a website called 4calendarcafe.com, and some references by David Pawson, who talks about Mark is not a biography. So I think recently, a decade ago, the trend used to be about movies coming in part 1 and part 2, right? And now the recent trend is getting into a universe of movie where you watch a movie and then few years later, there's another movie gets into the same universe. Of course, you'll not understand, but we'll all have to envisage from the days of Marvel that we'll have to connect. So wanted to follow the same pattern, wanting to get into the universe of Sudarshan, who took the word last week on remedy to drifting away, where he talks about a character called Demas, who stands as a moral, not so good moral of drifting. And it was very interesting that how God caught my attention at the verse that he finished on 2 Timothy 4:11, where he says, "Bring Mark with you. He'll be my right-hand man," said by Paul. And thanks to Sudarshan for the word. And I thought I will bring Mark today as an extension of what Demas and Mark were in the face of apostolic word, especially dealing with Paul and Barnabas and Peter and Jesus. So the title for the sermon today is called I Am Mark. Did I name it wrong? No. I very deliberately named it as I Am Mark, trying to relate, bringing a lot of cohesivity to Mark's character to a personal testimony in comparison to what Demas has been through. Again, going back, like every time when I on the stage I say, what message do I prepare? And then always my inclination is towards technology or science. Then I thought probably I'll take a bit of DNA around, still having a touch which I cannot let it go. And the DNA for a change will be only concerning the title of this message. A disclaimer, this is not a Lighthouse series. Very consciously, my cell leader wanted to declare this. This is not a Lighthouse series, but more than happy to have a series that is interconnected. I don't know if it's happened in the past, but I'm more than happy to interconnect a message to something which has been recently heard, right? That also assesses and tests how much have we heard last week, depending on you'll understand better. It's exactly like if you watch the first movie right, then you understand the second movie right. That doesn't mean we'll have to play a recap of Sudarshan's message now, but assuming that it stays in that. So DNA stands as a good interconnection for a good reason. And this is only an extension to Sudarshan's message about dangers of drifting. And it is definitely a story about a reconciler who restored from a place of lost and coming back. So it's an extension of what happens to dangers of drifting and then being restored. And definitely it's a story and a title that will predominantly evolve around Demas to Mark, who both had the same rhythm and pattern, but were delivered at a different result. So I'm more than happy to invite myself as a Mark to share some commonalities of how Mark bounced back in comparison to Demas. So to set the stage, let's put up Mr. Mark's curriculum vitae. Mr. Mark Aka John, and I think it's called as John or Mark, a quitter, but who finished well. And the entire message will revolve around, starting from Acts 12, verse 12, where Mark has been introduced, and then we'll flow through the messages and to the verse where Sudarshan let it last as 2 Timothy 4:11, where Paul invites him as helpful. Paul invites him as a hand in help. Historically, there's always been a confusion about Mark's genesis. It could be either island of Cyprus, or few commentators says it could also be Jerusalem. But I thought I'll take the benefit of island of Cyprus just because he is a cousin to Barnabas, and Barnabas is based out of island of Cyprus. So taken the benefit of island of Cyprus. In Greek, Mark means soft and tender. I don't know how much will, definitely my wife wouldn't agree that I'm soft and tender. So we will leave that benefit just for Mark. He is also called as a stubby finger. So historically, while he was growing up in a temple, he wanted to see himself as a priest. And then he had an injured finger, which did not qualify him to become a priest. So because of which he had to exit the temple, and he never became a priest. Why priest? He comes from the Levi, tribe of Levi, just as Barnabas is. Comes from the tribe of Levi. So the inclination of him wanting to be a priest was a natural DNA, but ultimately he couldn't because of the defect, the physical defect that he carried in his body. His house is more or less like probably the Soul Garage or any of the cell house, I think. Right? Anybody can stop by, grab a good set of food on the table, especially for the believers and the passerbys. So it's called as a roll call of first century saints. And in fact, the first time Mark is found there in the same house when Peter encounters. So speaking about Mark John or John Mark, however it is called as, if John or if Mark had to bounce back in comparison to what Demas did, I personally think definitely there was an influence of the team that he was surrounded with. Team is just being more corporate-y. Definitely involves about, like how Anna, you shared yesterday about where do we rub with each other? Where is the other iron that I'm seeking myself to be sharpened? So with a remarkable team by my side, we consistently finish strong and achieve greatness, not individually, but also together. So, importance of a team, and let's see what was Mark's awesome team, I call as. The first team member for Mark is Barnabas, who's his own cousin. This is again confusion between either a nephew or a cousin. Again, let's take it generic as Barnabas being the cousin. The mention in Colossians 4:10 where Paul calls out saying, my fellow prisoner Aristarchus sends you his greetings, as does Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. You have received instructions about him. If he comes to you, welcome him. So basically Paul is introducing Mark as cousin of Barnabas. And again, the interesting aspect of Barnabas is he is the segue for Paul to be invited into the apostolic family. He is the one who created the space, convinced all the apostles saying that no longer it is Saul, he has turned out to be Paul, who is a follower of Christ. So Barnabas plays a very crucial role in inviting Paul. And then he also intercedes for Saul. Like I said, he convinces the disciples that his Pharisees has truly become a follower of Christ. And just like all the other apostles, Barnabas also sold the field and bought the money and put it in the feet of apostles. So the first team member, Barnabas, Aka called Joseph or Oses, which means son of encouragement. That's what Barnabas is called for, a very positive character who led the most important character of the New Testament, who wrote 16 books, which is Saul, Elias, Paul. And he plays a vital role in the life of Mark, which we will see in the coming slides. The next team member is Mr. Peter, who apparently plays a role of a spiritual father. It's always nice to say a biological father and a spiritual father, right? It says it all. A lot of us will redirect here as a spiritual father. Good to have a spiritual father, and it's good for a spiritual father to say that you are my spiritual son. I can claim anyone in this congregation as a spiritual father, but I want the spiritual father to claim me as a spiritual son. Like how, so this is the first encounter in Acts 12:12, when Peter is escaping from the prison with the help of an angel, where he lands down. When this had dawned on him, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, also called Mark, where many people had gathered and were praying. So this is the first intervention of Mark coming into the apostolic family. This is the first intervention of Peter and Mark meeting together in his own house. And like I said, Peter claims as she who's in Babylon, which is Rome those days, elect together with you, greets you, and so does Mark, my son. So there is a series of interceptions in a positive way between Peter and Mark, that Peter himself claims that Mark's to be his spiritual son. Very interestingly, the Gospel of Mark is a recitation by Peter. The reason being is Mark believed in what was unseen. He was not a follower of Christ, lived in the same era, but not a direct follower. So all that he could write as the Gospel of Mark is an accurate record of Peter's teaching, where Mark is a scribe. So which gave him more opportunity to interact closer with Peter. And the last is a beautiful part where only in the Gospel of Mark, where Peter declares his humiliation, weaknesses, and embarrassments, which means the fellowship between Mark and Peter was so strong and so open that he was able to exhibit it so transparent. So the second character, Peter, has definitely played the biggest role of the entire characters, next to God himself, of being a spiritual father in changing Mark's journey. And the third character is Paul, who's the actual interceptor, who comes in, who gets out, who makes it difficult for a good reason, and he is the fellow worker. So we'll speak a little more in detail about Paul, but just few captures is the common network between Paul and Marcus, Barnabas. Barnabas, who invites Paul to the apostolic family, and Mark is invited to Paul via Barnabas. So there's a commonality between Barnabas, Paul, and Mark. Paul recognized Mark to be a close acquaintance of Barnabas, which he also calls it out. Mark served as a helper in Paul's missionaries. That's where the entire life journey of Mark changes in the missionary journey along with Paul and Barnabas. In Philemon 1:24, Paul refers to Mark as one of his fellow workers, as Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke, my fellow workers. This is the only passage which stands common for both Mark and Demas, who were in the same position to Paul as fellow workers. He didn't say Mark is my first fellow worker and Demas is second. There was an equal weightage that Paul as a missionary gave it to Mark and Demas. There was a crucial moment when things changed in the life of Mark, is Mark's apostasy, where he refrained. We'll again see more in detail with Paul and reconciliation between the both. So the third character becomes the most eminent character, recreating Mark's characteristics, recreating Mark to prepare himself to bounce back. And the last but not the least is the master himself. not seen, only heard, unheard directly or unheard indirectly. But as a young man, Mark grew up in the early days of the church. He was neither a follower nor a disciple, but he would have definitely been familiar with all that was happening around there. There's a good, sorry about that. Okay, so Mark likely compiled Peter's account of Jesus' life, and in the Gospel of Mark, he clearly portrays Jesus as the Son of God and the Messiah who came to serve and to sacrifice his life for the salvation of humanity. How wonderful it is. He has not seen Jesus, probably one instance which is recorded in the next line, but he's not experienced Jesus directly. He's not followed Jesus directly. He's not been a disciple. He's not shared the table. He's not shared the word. He's not shared testimonies, but he chose to believe that Jesus is the Messiah. He chose to believe what was unseen than what was seen. He chose to believe not just the law, but about the salvation. He chose to believe what he heard it through in the language of Peter, but claimed that Jesus would be the ultimate solution for anybody, including Mark. One interesting capture in Mark 14, 51, 52, unlikely or likely could be the character Mark, where a young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. Commentary says probably it could be Mark himself, and he didn't want to kind of claim it in his book, but this could be the only encounter while Jesus was still around and Mark intervened. And this is all that he has it with Jesus 101, but rest all the difference what Mark has made today is from hearing in likes of Peter. So, to conclude this quadrant, what is it to have an important team around? How important it is for us, apart from Sunday, through Monday to Saturday, whom are we rubbing our shoulders with? Whom are we connected? What are we connected to? What are the aspects of life that we speak? What are we sharing? What are the jokes that we share? What are the groups that we part of? Ask yourself, whom are you teaming with? I recall a few years back, at the time of COVID, when there's a rough phase in my life that creeped in, and I had regular green teas. It was not timetable to be weekly or monthly. It could have been every third day or every fourth day. And then I remember Ashokana saying one thing: who are you rubbing your friendship with? The more you are around with the people in church, the more you are around with people of God, your life gets better, your family starts having better faith in you, and your work gets better because you're still taking a lot of what God's principalities to the place that you work. In fact, when I invited Ajit, I very candidly said, Ajit, you're going to come to a place where I draw all my energy on Sunday. For me to rush through Monday to Saturday is because of God and Word and people of God around here. So I'm very, very conscious in choosing my acquaintances, in choosing my team, in choosing the people if I'm going to operate just out of my office hours or even within my office hours. I'm very, very careful in choosing to see what is the aura that I am giving, what is the aura that I am receiving. So ask yourself, what are you teaming with? That's a good team that Mark has formed. But what are the crossroads that Mark and Demas come along? What are the commonalities that Mark and Demas went through that they took different crossroads? One is lost in history, one is remembered even till this minute that we're discussing. Let's see what are the crossroads. The crossroads, the decisions that shape our destiny. It's every decision that we make that shapes our today and tomorrow. Like whoever, a famous saint, said that what we are today is what the decision that we made yesterday. What we are tomorrow will be the decisions and the choice that we make today. If there are crossroads, that even more, it's very empirical for us to make the right decisions. Mark drifting, Mark also drifted, which Sudarshan did not mention because he was more focused on Demas. But let's see, Mark also drifted, which is what the word calls as Mark's apostasy. Apostasy is not being under a leadership, not being obedient, not being obedient to a spiritual call, but rather being in carnal flesh. That is the phase that Mark went through with apostasy with Paul. From Paphos, Paul and company put out to sea, sailing on to Perga in Pamphylia. That's where John called it quit and went back to Jerusalem. Multiple commentaries replaces the word quit as abandoned or deserted or isolated. Going back to the message of Demas, I will rather replace it with deserted. Mark deserted Paul and Barnabas in Acts 13:13. The two interesting things which is not called out here. Mark did it even before Demas did it. That's an order. If you saw the first message or the introduction of Mark was Acts 12:12, and in the next chapter 13:13, Mark is out. The journey, the first season or the first chance of Mark to be associated with people of God lasted just one chapter, my friends. It was so short that he just disappeared. And what happened in 2 chapters later in 15, Barnabas is attempting again because it's a cousin. Sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, let us go back and visit the believers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they are doing. Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them, but Paul did not think it was wise to take him because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the believers to the grace of the Lord. Acts 15, verse 36 to 40. Eventful, right? Within few chapters, 12, Mark is introduced, 13 is out, and 15, Barnabas is wanting to take once again Mark in the journey, and Paul says, dude, are you sure? He already is out in the picture. Do you really want to take it? And then with our own imagination, we can think what that could have been a sharp or a strong disagreement, and the disagreement led not the crossroads of Demas and Mark. It was a crossroads of two leaders, which is Paul and Barnabas. Imagine the kind of cost and the penalty what Paul had to pay to the one who invited to Barnabas. Barnabas invited Paul to the entire journey. Barnabas is out and Paul is in. Demas was still there and Mark is out. So whose crossroads it is? So if I take a call today saying that I step out for A, B, C reason, from the congregation, from the church, what are the crossroads that my family will pay, the penalty? What are the penalties that my children would pay? And what would be the penalty that anyone else would pay will be unknown. I have gone. And when I say I have gone, Barnabas was gone. 14 years. Impact of Mark's apostasy from the book of Acts to Galatians, there is no mention of Barnabas. Not that Barnabas let go of God, not that Barnabas let go of sharing the love that he had for Jesus, not that Barnabas stopped getting into the road of salvation, but he's not registered from the book of Acts to Galatians. And in Galatians 2:1, Paul calls out saying, then after 14 years, I went up to Jerusalem. This time with Barnabas, I took Titus along also. So, we can always blame it on Mark. Dude, you did it all. And then there are two leaders who went away. There's still a lot of commentaries and debates says, Who was better, Paul or Barnabas? There are no sufficient records to justify Barnabas was equal or he was better. Just because Paul had the grace and advantage to write all the 16 plus books, but Barnabas was away, probably still doing what he was, but he was not registered. Do we realize that a forgiving God does not mean that we have an indulgent God? And the man who quits from the will of God is hurting God, wounding the Spirit, and grieving the Holy Ghost. How many times do we even think? I didn't think. I was that Mark. Not just stepped out. I jumped out. I jumped out. I went deep inside, like how Ashit called out, like how Freddie called out, that immersed in the ocean into our own sinful lives, picking up rubbish stones under the ocean where the church was far away from me. The consequences, yes, we'll talk about the consequences more. So, Mark's drifting splits, of course, Demas and Mark, but it splits also the two leaders. Now, let's see the chronology. Just a recap. First mention of Mark is Acts 12:12. Nicely, he comes in with a large house. He's been served by his mother. Mother teaches him to love God, love people of God, and love the word. And then 13:13, he disappears. Mark deserts Paul, but technically Mark deserts Paul, Barnabas, and few more who were in the first missionary. And 15:36, Barnabas, being a nice guy, a son of encouragement, is trying to invite Mark back into the act, but Paul, being Paul, a typical Roman, says, nope, let him stay away, and then they split. Paul reintroduces Mark in Colossians 4:10, a bunch of chapters, books later, a very soft mention of Mark. My fellow prisoner, Aristarchus, sends you his greetings, as does Mark, a cousin of Barnabas. A very, very subtle mention. And in Philemon 1:24, there is Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke as my fellow workers, which means Mark has already bounced back, which we'll speak a little more in detail. And then Mr. Demas deserts Paul. For Demas, because he loved the world, loved this world, has deserted me and has gone to Thessalonica. So if I'll have to relate the order is very, very clear. And very interestingly, if you go by the order, the very next verse to 2 Timothy 4:10, where Demas leaves, 2 Timothy 4:11, Mark is re-recognized by Paul saying that you are back, which we will see. So there is series of events that happens. What are the commonalities of this deserting? What did both Demas and Mark desert? Of course, it is Paul and his missionary, but technically it was the God and ministry that they were invited to serve. It was the associated blessings what the God and the ministry would have given, could have given, and the will of God, which is definitely an important aspect which they failed to receive. Mark in the first chance and Demas forever to eternity. Mark claimed it back in the second chance. And self. What are the deserting? They're deserting themselves from the house of God, from associated to people of God, from associated to the blessings of God, from association to the ministry that you can serve into the world. And Demas was very, very clear. He deserted himself to this world, but there are no reasons recorded why Mark jumped off the ship and went directly back to Jerusalem. There's absolutely no mention. There is no reasoning. There could be some reasoning that we can claim, but what are the crossroads that we need to ask ourselves? Crossroads that decides and shape our destiny is something that we need to ask ourselves. At what point in life did you or I drift away from God? And what are the reasons? Is it the world, or is it another belief system altogether? Is it a personal influence or is it an external influence? Ask yourself, at what point did we drift away from God? Now coming to the core, what does it mean to bounce back? And Mark teaches a good lesson about bouncing back. And he clearly claimed, if not now, never. Because he was already in the grace of second chance. If not now, never. What are the results? Or by bouncing back, what does it result in? Like I said, 2 Timothy 4:10, Demas deserts Paul. And 2 Timothy 4:11, Paul calls saying, get John Mark and bring him with you to me because he is helpful to me in my ministry. And the other translation says, profitable to my ministry. So the very next verse, Paul calls or re-recognizes Mark being bounced back. It is the realizing the matchless patience of a God who gives a second chance. It is recorded that Mark embraced the second chance. It is not recorded that Demas either had a second chance or not, but there's no record of it. Probably God, being God, consistent to everybody, he would have granted and offered the second chance to Demas as well, but he didn't embrace. But Mark embraced the second chance. A runaway coward to a comforter and profitable in God's ministry. In the book of Colossians, where Paul sends greetings, he says, I'm sending greetings on behalf of Mark as well, which means he was assessing, which means he was helping Paul at the time of imprisonment as a helper, as a comforter. And now he calls Mark as a profitable one to God's ministry. A quitter from the training camp. He was probably just at the training camp, trying to learn from his team of Barnabas, Peter, Paul, and the life of Jesus. And he quit from there, and later he was in the front line of the battle for master's use. When one embraces a second chance that God throws it out to you, if you catch it right, just in time, the story of Mark is applicable to as well. There are two contrasts where we learn from Demas and Mark. One provides a word of warning, the other provides the word of hope. Hope comes from the Lord, who still favors, who still gives us a second chance. But what does it take? What does it take for a person like Mark to bounce back? Demas, why didn't bounce? Again, it could be our own permutation and combination that we can lay. Probably he had the fear of ministry, probably he had the fear of persecution, probably he had the fear of even being denied because he was still rubbing shoulders with Peter. Probably even that could have caught up to his head saying, what if I am being denied at the time of a caught up? That could just be a permutation combination. But what did it take? Again, the probability for Mark. Mark considered himself as a prodigal son. Embraced the second chance that was given to him. God either forgives, I deliberately put in a full stop there. It's a full stop, not a comma. God forgives or forgave. Either it is done or will be done. There's no present continuous like God is forgiving. No. God either completely forgives or completely forgave. But unfortunately, the society that we handle will forgive only when you prove with them data, or even if you forgiven, have not forgotten. That's the difference between the society of forgiveness and God's forgiveness. It's a full stop, done, dusted. Like Fadi said, he throws iniquities at a power that he can never take it back, or he doesn't prefer to take it back. But we, the creation of own God, want to forgive only when there is enough data, or will forgive, but will never forget. I will hold it. My memory is strong. I cannot. If at all Paul had to treat Mark in the same character, he wouldn't have found Mark to be profitable. He wouldn't have found Mark to be comfort. He wouldn't have found Mark to be helpful in the ministry. Paul probably, knowing Jesus the closest after the apostles, replicated the act of forgiveness to Mark in reclaiming back. till the last end of days. Why did he bounce? What did Mark do in those chapters from the time that he jumped off the ship to Jerusalem and coming back later? He learned it from his spiritual mentors or discipleship. He had 3 concrete discipleship that he worked in flesh and blood. Peter, who taught the love of Jesus, also to be a follower of Christ. Barnabas, who encouraged him to embrace the second chance. Barnabas was ready to split away from Paul for the sake of Mark, saying, "Son, come, I will take you, I will mentor you, I will disciple you, and put you back into the herd where you stepped off." And Paul probably taught him to focus and to embrace the passion for rest of the world. And the commentator says that he was also discipled by his mother for the love of God and love of word and love of the believers. When I stepped back on my first chance, I had my discipleship and spiritual mentors who put the love of Jesus back in my life, who put the love of what is to hold the word, what is to follow the word back into my lives. Second chance were openly given. It was upfront in my table to say, not that take it or leave it. I was not given an option. Take it. This is your second chance. And I wouldn't take all the pride to say, I took it with my ability, but rather it was the Spirit of God who made me to embrace the second chance in my life. And now, the Mark in me makes to put the focus back onto passion of the world, passion of the word, and passion for the ones who does not knows the word. So, can I add the question mark on my behalf? Can you add the question mark into your life? Are you a Mark or are you a Demas? Are you in a crossroad where you're just in a junction to say, do I take and leave and be forgotten, or do I take and come back and be remembered in rest of the history? I am Mark is convincing to me, go back and mull over yourself to see, are you a Mark in the life of Jesus? We have not seen Jesus. We have not been in the era of Jesus. It's centuries ago, but we still believe in unseen. Do we want to remain till eternity? My last takeaways is might. It is not by your strength, but by His might you will bounce back. It is not by our strength, it is by might. To relate it to today's theme of the worship, I would rather replace might to be mercy. Compassionate mercy that will alone bring us back to God. Accomplish. One who started will accomplish it for you. All that you got to do is obey. The job for us is to obey. His purpose will be fulfilled by the accomplisher who's called you. Reward. Reward for our obedience is to finish well. If we finish well, we receive our reward and the kingdom. Path to the kingdom is an upward journey in the life of Mark in comparison to path to wherever Demas was or found was a downward slippery slide. For Mark, it was the kingdom, the upward journey. Might or mercy, accomplish, reward, kingdom. Convincing to say Mark is a follower of Christ. In conclusion, why all this? Why would God put in our heart in the days of Pharaoh or in the days of Demas to not choose a path? It's all for just one of this. If you are a lamb who will be found as one sheep to be lost, this man in the picture will come after you, redeeming you from any wolves that surrounds you. In seeking one lost sheep that has gone astray, God does after it. God goes after it at any cost. God, you lack nothing, yet you desire me small. All that I or you, us, will have to do is let the world to loose grip on me. Demas gave the chance to the world saying, take me in. He gave the grip to the world. But Mark said, let the world lose the grip on me that I will be held back with God. So request the media team to play the song which is relevant to this conclusion message.